Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for taking time out in the middle of the day, at least on the East Coast, and early morning in California, and late afternoon in the UK, to join us to talk about the Brazilian Amazon with our guest, Fabio Ribeiro. Fabio is an anthropologist, co-founder and executive coordinator of OPI, the Observatory for the Human Rights of Isolated and Recently Contacted Indigenous People in Brazil. He has degrees in economics, environmental sciences, and anthropology. And he's also a researcher at the Center for Amerindian Studies of the University of Sao Paulo. Fabio, we're so pleased that you could join us today. Unusually for these webinars, I'm going to start by taking a few minutes myself before we move over to Fabio and your questions to remind you and update you a little bit about Rainforest Trust's Brazil Amazon strategy, which we launched with many of you last spring. Liz, can you just show that PowerPoint? Thank you. Next slide. So many of you will know that the Amazon is the largest tropical rainforest in the world, nearly the size of the continental US, harboring about a third of the Earth's terrestrial species and storing 123 billion tons of CO2. That's 20 times the US's entire annual CO2 emissions. Next slide. Many of you will also know that, particularly in Brazil, the Amazon has been in crisis. About 18% of the forest has already been destroyed, much of that for cattle agribusiness. And deforestation has escalated in the last 10 years, up 187%. And the tipping point that Rainforest Trust's board member, Tom Lovejoy, forecasted years ago seems to be almost here, the point at which there's so little forest left that rainfall recycling is interrupted and the rest of the system collapses to a savanna. But, next slide. We are in a time of opportunity in Brazil for the Amazon. President Lula returned to power at the beginning of this year and pledged to end all deforestation in the Amazon by 2030. And he particularly targeted the 29% of the forest which is intact and government-owned, but not yet designated for any purpose. And that's where the majority of the deforestation has been occurring. But he's got a 4-year term. We don't know what happens after that. And he's almost 1 year into it. So the clock is ticking on this opportunity. Next slide. Here is a map of the Brazilian Amazon. At the bottom, you can see a scale. So the area is huge. That line is 1,000 kilometers long. And here in this map, the red shows areas that have been deforested up until 2021. The dark green show areas that have been declared as indigenous territories, which is the highest form of protected area in Brazil, areas which are set aside for people living traditional lives and for nature. The bright green, the pale green, are other forms of protected areas that have been created. And for our purposes, the most important is the orange. The orange areas are areas which are intact forests still, government-owned, but not yet designated for any particular site, for any particular use. So that's the big opportunity. Next slide. And in the spring, I shared with many of you our strategy for the Brazilian Amazon. In these 4 years, we're aiming to protect 20 million new acres of intact forest with several objectives, pulling the Brazilian Amazon back from the tipping point that Lovejoy forecasted, locking up 6 billion tons of CO2, about the emissions of the US in 1 year, providing a home for at least 70 red-listed terrestrial species, and securing the territories for about 150,000 indigenous people. So we've been at it with all of you for about 6 months. How are we doing towards these goals? Next slide. Pretty well so far, thanks to you. Over $10 million have been contributed by all of you and our supporters. Almost that much has already been granted out to partners in Brazil. 5 projects have been launched, which, when they're complete, will protect 5.8 million acres of land, a vast area, and 125 threatened species, including 56 marine species, and 1.6 billion tons of stored carbon. Meanwhile, in Brazil, under the Lula administration, and thanks primarily to their enforcement efforts, deforestation is down some 40%. We'll have new data next week. But thanks to the tipping point and climate change, it also has been a terrible drought year, and that is leading to forest fires, which are a grave short-term concern. Next slide. I had the privilege to visit Brazil in August with our Brazilian board member, Luis Barroso, and this is us in the Pantanal, the vast swamp just south of the Amazon. Tragically, Luis died a month later. A huge loss, of course, for his family and for Brazil and for technology industry and for Conservation and Rainforest Trust. But while I was there, next slide, I also had a chance to attend the Amazon Summit that Lula convened with the other 7 countries of the Amazon. This is me with 2 Indigenous guardians of the forest at a film premiere about their fight. And I think that's enough on the PowerPoint. Thank you, Liz. But I was there for several days, and in that time got to meet many of our implementing partners and many of our government partners and other co-funders. It was tremendously valuable and inspiring. But of all the meetings I had, I can honestly say, Fabio, that the one that excited me the most and was most inspiring, which is why I invited you to join us here today, was the meeting with you. Now, maybe that was because of your extraordinary, gentle commitment to Indigenous people and their plight and the forest, or maybe it was your tremendous technical expertise, or maybe it was the amazing work of your organization, OPI, to gain legal recognition and permanent protection for the territories of Indigenous people living in voluntary isolation. Those are the few people still living absolutely traditional lives in the Amazon with limited or no contact with the rest of the world. And these are people who've been let it be known that they don't wish, they just wish to be left alone. This project, which we are launching today with support of our donors, with you, Fabio, will protect the territories of 3 such groups, areas of extraordinarily remote, intact Amazon rainforest. So I couldn't be more excited to welcome you. I know you're joining us from Sao Paulo. When I spoke to you last week, you were joining us from a cabin in the middle of the Amazon and joined by an Indigenous friend. And I'm only slightly disappointed that although the internet connection wasn't good, the excitement of talking to you when you were actually there was pretty amazing. And the opportunity to meet your friend was mind-blowing. But you're now in Sao Paulo with a better connection, and we're so grateful that you could join us today. Thank you.
Hello, James. Thank you. Nice to hear you. And thank you for inviting me to join this webinar. I'm really happy to be here today talking with you. So I will present myself shortly and then a little bit about my trajectory in indigenous lands in the Amazon, and then a little bit as well about the public policy of the protection of isolated groups. So, hi everybody. My name is Fabio Ribeiro. I'm from Brazil. I am born in São Paulo and I have 40 years today. And I am an economist. I have a bachelor degree in economic science, and I have a master's degree in environmental science, and I have a PhD in social anthropology. And I'm working with indigenous groups in the Brazilian Amazon for 20 years, since 2003. And I lived in the beginning with the Assurini do Xingu people. It's a Tupi Guarani speaking group who inhabits the middle Xingu River uh, near the city of Altamira in Pará. And then 7 years later, I moved to Santarém, and then I started to work with the Zoé people, recently contacted Tupi-Guarani speaking group, who live in the north side of the Brazilian Amazon, nearby the border of Brazil and Suriname. And I lived there with them for 10 years. And this time I learned how to speak their language, and my PhD thesis is about their oral history. And well, in 2010, I joined FUNAI, the Federal Bureau of Protection of Indigenous Lands and Indigenous Rights. And I worked in the government, in the Brazilian state for 12 years, coordinating some units of protection of isolated groups in the middle Xingu River and in the region of the border of Brazil in the Guianas. And during the pandemics and under Bolsonaro government, when the indigenous rights were under hard attack, we decided, a group of specialists, including myself, we decided to launch a new NGO, a new organization focused exclusively on the protection of isolated groups and their lands. So this is the OPI, the Human Rights Watch or Observatory for isolated indigenous groups in the Brazilian Amazon. And one of our colleagues were Bruno Pereira, the human rights defender who were brutally murdered last year with the British journalist Don Phillips in the Javari River Valley. And well, since the beginning, I was elected as the executive coordinator of this observatory. And until today, I am in this position. So, uh, please, Liz, I want to show the map. May I? May I turn off the screen? Okay. So I would like shortly show you this map. Can you see it, James? Can you see the map?
That's great. It's working fine. And somebody,
Yes.
if you could try to speak a little bit louder or
Okay.
turn up volume at all.
All right. So this is the map of the Amazon basin. Okay. So here we have the countries here, and here we have the isolated groups in Brazil. And here we have indigenous lands in Brazil. So you can see in the map that we have three great concentrations of isolated groups in Brazil. The first one is the region of the Javari Valley in the border of Brazil and Peru in the upper Amazon. The second one is the concentration in the border of Peru and Acre in the Purus and Juruá river basins. And the third concentration is in the region of the northwest Mato Grosso and the state of Rondônia, mainly in the Guaporé and the Madeira river basins and the Rondônia state in Brazil. So in this map, you can see this legend. So the round records are the confirmed ones. So the losango records are the records under study today, but the very existence of these isolated groups are not yet confirmed. And the squared ones are records that we have only a weak information about the presence of isolated groups in these regions. So we cannot speak or talk about the public policy of protection of isolated groups without talking about the role of FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, today the Indigenous Peoples Bureau, and the general coordination of isolated indigenous groups, because this general coordination is the responsible for the protection of these groups and of these lands. So today, the Brazilian government have 11 decentralized units in the Brazilian Amazon to protect the isolated groups. And I coordinated exactly two of these fronts in the Xingu region, right in this one, and in the Cumina-Panema River protection front right in this region. The Zoe land is right in this one. The question is, this structure of the state is not enough to guarantee the protection of these huge areas of forest, neither the protection of isolated groups. So in 2019, we decided to launch the OPI, mainly in order to fight for the land against the Bolsonaro government, because they want to give the lands for the farmers and for the miners, and they tried to destroy this right of indigenous peoples to the land and to self-determination. And since then, we are writing technical reports for the prosecutors, and we are trying to articulate a huge network of indigenous organizations who work on the ground in the direction of protection of isolated indigenous groups. We are working in an international level as well, mainly in the United Nations and in the human rights and Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in Washington. We are accompanying some cases, and during the pandemics, we helped to denounce Bolsonaro for the how they say about the vaccinations, and he didn't want it to do that. And so today we are starting with Rainforest Trust this project of the objective of the project is to support FUNAI to regularize 3 areas occupied by indigenous groups in the Amazon. So this is the first area called the Mamoria region. This is the second area called the Jatapu River. And this is the third area called the Pirichichi River. I will turn off my screen, and please, Liz, can you share the presentation and the first map so we can, the second slide, please. So we can see this area called Mamoria. It's in the region of the city of Labria, in the edge of the Purus River, in the southwest portion of the Amazonas state. This is the Araru indigenous lands occupied by an isolated group. And here is the Pirichichi indigenous lands, a really pressed area under pressure because of the road that connects Manaus to Boa Vista in the state of Roraima. So in the beginning of the next year, we are going to start this project and to support the field work of the work groups that are writing technical reports to regularize these lands. And in all of these 3 lands, we are going to support plans of protection of the land with the National Foundation and indigenous organizations that lives in the neighborhood of these lands of isolated groups. So it's a hard contest in Brazil, but we also agree that there is a window of opportunity and we have to work hard in the beginning of this government. But we understand that with the support, for sure, this land will have a like we will walk to the finishing of the process. So that's it. In short, my trajectory and the work we are doing today. So James, we can share as well our website and well the social networks. If somebody can follow us, we are doing several things. So thank you again, James, and I would like to hear and to
Great.
answer
We
some
can
questions.
we'll send out a thank you note after the event, and we can put your website and your social media accounts
Yes.
there if anyone wants to
Um,
follow directly. That would be great.
and I have some pictures, James, that I would like to show you, like if you
Please.
have 2 or 3 minutes. So, Liz,
Yes, please.
well, this is the specific maps, the second one, the third one, the next one. Liz, please. This is the Piritichi land. You can see the road there. And these are pictures of isolated groups. This one is in the really headwaters of the Juruá River, the
Are those
border of
people that we
Brazil.
see
And
looking up?
they're looking up to the plane. They are trying to arrow the plane. So, well, it's a stranger, no, who comes from outside. The next, the next slide, please. This is the longhouse of the Corubo people. This picture was taken in 1995 in a flight, and the Corubo, it's a big, recently contacted, or maybe there are still some isolated people in the forest in the Javari Valley indigenous lands in the upper Amazon, in the border of Brazil and Peru. The next one, please. This is another longhouse of Korubu people, and we estimate like 150 people living inside this house, and in the same region of Javari Valley. The next one, please. The Korubu, two Korubu men meeting each other in the contact of one of these groups in 2015, like not so many years ago. The next one, please. This is a Suruaha woman, and she lives in the region of the Purus River, nearby the land that the Rainforest Trust project will support, one of the three, the Mamoria one. So Mamoria, if we have enough power to recognize this land, it will be neighbor to the Suruaha land, who is the house of this beautiful woman with a really kind painting in her face, probably the jaguar. The next one, please. Well, this is my friend in the right with glasses is there. This is Bruno Pereira, and in the left it's the British journalist murdered in June 5 last year, and well, it was a great promotion here in Brazil and specifically for us because he was our friend and married to a friend of us as well, Beatriz. Well, it's a really sad history. Well, you probably heard about this tragedy. And the next picture, please. This is a picture of the Zoé village. It was I did this picture in a flight as well. This is mine. And it's a really nice village in the Zoeland, about 50 people living there in the upper Cuminapanema River. The next one, please. And this is the Javari River in the upper Amazon. A really beautiful river and a huge rainforest as well there. And I think these are the pictures I pre prepared. So this is my email, and that's it. Thank you. Thank you again.
It's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing the pictures with us and the maps, Fabio. Just lovely. I have a whole bunch of questions to ask, but I want to allow our visitors to have a chance to ask questions as well, and a few have already jotted something down. So if you don't mind, I'll just jump in and read you a question or two from the guests, if that's all right, Fabio. Thanks.
Yes,
Um,
it's okay.
the first question was, are the proposed areas surrounded by deforested land, or are they surrounded by intact forest?
Mhm. Well, two of these lands, they are completely surrounded by rainforest. Uh, and the third one, the Pirititi one you saw in the map, it's in the area of influence of a Brazilian road that connects like Manaus to Boa Vista to the north. It's the road that connects Brazil to Venezuela. So this road was built in the 60s under military government, and it was like there are several records, and then there is a commission in the Brazilian Congress about the crimes committed by the military government during the dictatorship. And one of the crimes was against exactly these indigenous peoples who live in this region. So probably the PDPT group is a group that ran in that time of the building of the road. Probably then they run deep in the forest, running away of the colonization. And well, we got this information only 50 years later in 2010 when their longhouse were discovered again. So, but the
But
majority of
I
the
mean, to
areas
get
are
back,
surrounded by forest.
so two of them are completely surrounded by intact forest, and the third has
Yes.
intact forest on one side, and then development on the other side, and is extending the sort of buffer zone, as I recall from the map, right?
Yeah, not exactly. It's an area under pressure of deforestment, but it is not yet finished the process of colonization. So we have several operations of the environmental services against illegal logging and things like that. It's a hard place. That is,
Understood.
well,
Another question from I'm not telling people's names, but this happens to come from someone who used to be the head of conservation at Rainforest Trust. So we're delighted to have him back taking part. And he asks that he assumes that these would become indigenous territories under Brazil's laws if the project succeeds. And he asks, how would you describe the level of environmental protection that indigenous territories affords compare and how would that protection be enforced? So what level of legal protection for the forest, I think he means in particular, does this provide and who enforces it?
okay. Well, in these three lands we choose, there are those units I said, and the ethno-environmental fronts of protection. So in the Mamoria area, we have an unit called Madeira Purus Environmental Fronts. In Pirititi, in the Pirititi area in Roraima, we have the Vaimiria Troari Ethno-Environmental Front. It's a FUNAI unit as well to protect that. those areas. And in the area of the Jatapu, the Araru land, we have Kuminapanema Ethno-Environmental Front. So there are three units of the Federal Bureau. And through the project, we want to empower these units to buy equipment and, well, several other things in order to construct a plan of protection of this land. So it includes training indigenous groups who lives in the neighborhood of these lands and constructing posts in two of the three lands we wrote in the project and in the budget resources to build some posts in
Yeah.
strategic areas, mainly in the mouth of the secondary rivers. So we have this well methodology of localizing posts of security in this area. So on the ground, on the field, I think the project will it will be really nice to work on it because in these three areas we are already connected to indigenous organizations that work in these bases, in these areas. So the idea is to connect the teams of the federal units of the government and indigenous organizations in order to do a joint work of protecting these lands. So that's what we are planning for the work.
No, that makes sense. I think that answers the second of the two questions the individual was asking, which is what will the enforcement mechanism be? I think what he was getting at in his first question was within Brazil's legal framework,
Okay.
what sort of legal protection does the designation of an indigenous territory in principle bestow on a piece of land? What are people allowed to do and not allowed to do in an indigenous territory in the future by law, assuming that the laws are well enforced?
Yeah. Well, today we have a great question in the Brazilian Congress because they are voting laws against the protection of indigenous rights. But until today, we have yet the Article 231 of the Federal Constitution. So what does it say? It says that the use fruit of indigenous lands are exclusively indigenous. So and no economic activity inside. So we are trying these three areas to enforce, well, PDT indigenous land is already recognized. So we are in the last phase of this process, but it is already a recognized indigenous land. So that's why we have already have several operations of federal policy against
Can I
environmental
can I jump
crimes.
in? So I mean, backing up to people who are completely new to the Brazilian legal system,
Yeah,
indigenous territories are declared in perpetuity forever.
yeah,
They provide for the exclusive use of that land by that indigenous group who the territory is granted to. And correct me if I'm wrong, they don't allow commercial, industrial logging or
no,
mining or petroleum
no,
development or agriculture.
no,
They only allow
no.
traditional uses.
Yes, traditional uses.
And then I would
And
add, to the person who asked the question that for Rainforest Trust, we try to focus our efforts on those particular projects to create indigenous lands where the human population density is low in the area. People are leading very traditional lives. And so it's likely that for the foreseeable future, their traditional lives will not have a hugely negative impact on the environment.
mhm,
So that's
mhm,
specifically, we don't, Rainforest Trust, we don't support just any indigenous territory. We support those which our research suggests have a very strong chance of effective nature
yeah,
protection as well. Does that
mhm.
make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, James. And in the process of constructing this project, we choose these three areas. And one of the criteria was really that the land was part of a greatest block of protected areas. So, in these three cases, we are proposing the recognition of areas that will be connected to a major block of protected areas.
Yeah.
So we are working with the concept of mosaic of conservation units. So if you look in the map, in the north side, the Pirititi and Araro indigenous lands, it will be connected to a block of indigenous lands with more than 10 millions of hectares. Okay. And in the Purus region, it's the same. I don't have the figures in mind, but it will be connected to a huge block of conservation units. And well, that's why we choose these strategic points, like Mamoria in the Purus. It was like an island of undesignated forest surrounded by indigenous lands and a conservation unit.
Yeah.
And in the Pichichi case, we are trying to
Do you want to
close
show the
the.
map? Do you want to show the map again, just so people can
I
see that
want to
briefly?
show you
I don't
that.
want to take too
Yeah.
long, but I remember the map, but that's because I've seen it 10 times, whereas for other people it's new.
You see the map? Can you see, James?
So that's the little skinny one that runs along the edge of a protected area with the risky area to its left. Yeah. So that's
So
the first. Yeah.
this is the first area,
Yeah.
Pirititi Indigenous area. And here we have Manaus, the city of Manaus.
Yeah.
And this is the road that cuts the forest until Boa
I
Vista.
mean,
That is,
of the three, that's the scariest one because the threats are so severe. But go on and show us the other two as well.
uh, this is the second area, James. So it's
Uh-huh.
surrounded by forest, okay? This
Yeah.
is the record we are talking about,
Yeah.
the Jatapu River. So these two areas, if you see in the map, they are connected to this huge block of indigenous lands.
Yeah.
In this block, we have more than 10 million hectares, okay? And this is connected to other indigenous lands here.
Yeah.
So it's a huge block of protected areas. And the second area is this region here. So we have, it's exactly this region
Yeah.
that we are going to recognize as an indigenous land, and it will be connected to this great block of indigenous lands as well.
No, I think that helps a
That's
lot for
why,
people to visualize.
yeah, that's why we choose these strategic regions in order
Good.
to consolidate these great blocks of indigenous lands. That's it.
Let me pick up on another of our guests here. And this is on the same, it's on the same theme. So I'm trying to group these by theme. So this individual asks, is hunting of threatened species such as harpy eagles or rare monkeys, is that hunting adequately controlled in these indigenous territories? By which I'm sure he means, um, is there a risk that people are going to eat all of the eagles or eat all of the monkeys, or do they are they either at such a low human population or they have such rudimentary technology or their regulations within their systems or whatever? What is the prognosis for these rare species that live in these indigenous territories?
James, it is, and all of these groups we are talking about, isolated groups, they are really low density groups. So we are talking about groups with 15 people, some of them 30, Some of them, the minority of them is more than 100 people. So, uh, for example, with the Zoe people where I live and where I studied a lot of time, they do hunt animals, but not all the time in the year. And they have this knowledge of how to conserve. So there are some species that they do not kill the females, only the males. And I have never seen them to kill, for example, all the pigs. Né? If they find pigs in the forest, they will not kill all of them because they don't need. Né? If they kill all of them in the same time, it will be spoiled. Né? So they kill, and when they need again, they kill. But I don't think it will be a hard effect. And because they are isolated groups, and because the politics is a policy, politics no, the policy of non-contacting this group, we don't have ways of controlling what they hunt. But it's not a practice made in a scale,
Yeah.
industrial scale,
I
or
mean, I mean, I know
like a
from I know from
commercial scale. Yeah,
I know from
something
my
like
own
that.
experience with in Central Africa that the biggest risk to wildlife population comes where the hunting is commercialized and people are hunting and
Yes,
selling the meat
yes,
to a larger
yeah,
community. If you've got 20 or 100 people living in a huge block of forest, they're only eating so much. The problem comes if they're
yeah,
hunting and then selling out. So the fact that these groups are uncontacted and are not
yes,
trading with neighboring groups is
mhm,
reassuring, I think.
yes, yes. And well, we have some data as well of people living in the forest, and it was a millenarian way of life. So they
Yeah.
do not think directly in terms of conservation, but they do conserve the forest because their way of life is that one. And so we have today a consensus with archaeologists that we have like 10,000 years of continuous living, living people in the Brazilian Amazon. And the very presence of these people is a tool for the production of biodiversity as well. So that's what I think.
On a different note, more of a personal note, one of our guests today asks, how do you reach a settlement of indigenous groups? By boat, walking through the forest, helicopter? How difficult? How far? And what is involved in getting there?
Nice question.
It is a
Well,
nice.
we have a methodology, né, that we say in Portuguese, we say a metodologia sertanista, né? We have these words in Brazil. It's a really old word, sertão, that is unexplored areas of the territory. So we have to be prepared to go deep in the forest. You have to like some medicines, mainly antibiotics, and we have to not to walk alone, never, and we have to let with you people who know the territory. That's why indigenous people are so important. But it's mainly a methodology composed by expeditions by land, conversations with the neighboring communities of the territories occupied by isolated groups because they do interact all over the years with these
That was
territories.
actually that was another question that someone was asking was these groups in
Yes,
isolation, do they have contact with other indigenous groups around them? Sorry to interrupt.
yes. And we also do a work of recognizing territories through airplane, small airplanes. and through satellite images as well. So it's like a pool of techniques in order to recognize this. But the most effective one is expeditions through the land, because otherwise you cannot find several trace elements and things under the forest. So it's the most refined technique, and it's when you spend 2 months or 3 months walking in the forest with experienced people in order to, well, to research these areas and gather information about what is going on and deep in these regions. And
Sorry, go ahead.
so, if they have contact with another indigenous groups, probably. But the question is that today we have several isolated groups that they are surrounded by destruction. So the old networks of relations, of ethnical relations, in several cases they were cut by roads and by a farm, by the forest. So we have several accounts of indigenous peoples that tell us about connections in the past and disconnections after a road or after the colonization. They don't have means anymore to reach someone else's territories, but we still have some huge areas in the Brazilian Amazon, maybe in the border of Guianas and Suriname, in the Javari River and the Yanomami indigenous lands. We still have huge portions of land unexplored, and we believe that in these areas there are still going on contacts among isolated groups and already contacted groups. That's it.
Interesting. Thank you. I'm just looking at some of the other questions here. Um, so two different donors or supporters or guests are asking about the relationship between politics and legal enforcement and actual enforcement. So I'll just read both questions. One person asks, what can you do to ensure the long-term legal and on-the-ground protection of these indigenous reserves in the long-term future, even if there were to be another hostile government like that of Bolsonaro? And then related to that, someone else asks, how will legal protection help against illegal activities, which by definition don't care about the law? What other measures can be used to protect these areas? So they're both asking, how do you assure that the areas that are protected on the map, in principle, legally, are actually protected in practice, both now, but also even in the future under different governments, and maybe even, God forbid, a hostile government again in the future?
Perfect. I will start from this last one. And this is a very good question, and that is why we are planning to work with indigenous organizations on the ground and with the FUNAI's units that work on the ground, in the land, on the territories, because from my own experience, I believe that the better way to protect these areas is through the we have to structure plans of protection and to train people, mainly indigenous groups, on the ground in order for them to protect their own land. So, because of course the macro politics in Brazil it's really important because well we saw in under Bolsonaro government what happened and in the mind of poor people of rural Amazonia, Bolsonaro was the guy that was going not to uh, fiscalize them, and he was allowing. No, he was. our master, and now we are free to the forest, and there will be no environmental bureaus working against us. And well, Bolsonaro in public discourses, he told that no, it's okay to mine, go on, you can invade indigenous lands, it will be okay under my government. So it's like a psychological, no? And then we saw that when Lula came back to the presidential position, this stimulation to illegal practice was cut. And then only in the first months of Lula's government, with the taxes of deforestation, I don't think it's only the active action of the state, but like a psychological action in the minds of people who wants to do this illegal practice. So I think it will be a really hard work for us because all the congressmen, mainly the majority of them, the majority of the Congress is against indigenous rights today. And but Lula is trying to negotiate some rights. That's the question, because it's a coalition government. So in this government, well,
Can
in
I add
this
one other thing?
negotiation of politics, sometimes we will not defend indigenous rights in order to have enough power to do other negotiations about, well, tributation and macro politics and level of interests and things like that. So
I Fabio, I was in a meeting with your Minister of the Environment, Marina Silva,
yes,
who is herself originally from the Amazon, a former rubber tapper,
yes,
um, learned to read at age 20. Amazing, amazing woman.
yes,
And someone asked her specifically this question. And interestingly, one of the things she said was, as bad as the Bolsonaro administration was, and as
yes,
much as deforestation rates increased under the Bolsonaro administration, they only increased a third of the way back to where they were at the beginning
yes,
of the first Lula administration. So,
yes,
the legal protections that the previous Lula administration put in place were under assault from the Bolsonaro administration, and they were weakened, and for deforestation increased, but it only
yes,
increased a third of the way back. So a certain amount of the legal structure held even under Bolsonaro, which I'd never heard
yes.
anyone say before, because generally people are, emphasize how terrible it was under Bolsonaro. But that was interesting. Whether that will be true in the future, I don't know.
Yeah, that's it. So we have never saw nothing like uh, what happened under Bolsonaro. It was terrible. Like people were dying, and indigenous lands were being invaded. So, well, I believe that we have to work in several levels. So we have to have an advocacy work in the higher level, trying to do an incidence in the Congress and in the judicial process of justice and in this process of regularization. But I believe on the on the work on the ground. If indigenous organizations and small scale work in indigenous lands, it is very important because people are there, people are things are going on the ground. So if we lose this knowledge of what is going on the villages, in the forests, in the rivers, and in the borders of these lands, we will have no chance to defend. Uh, Even if we have a window of opportunity in the higher level, we do not have power in the lower level, in the ground. Well, that's what I think.
We only have 2 more minutes, and we like to end
Okay.
pretty much on time, being aware that people have other things to get to. I just mention one question, which I think I'll answer just to keep it fast. One individual is asking whether we could lobby our own governments to bring pressure on them to honor Indigenous tribes. And certainly within each of countries around the world, that is a movement that many people join, which is wonderful. I will say that when Bolsonaro was in place, he was quite resistant to pressure from outside. In talking to people, the one area of pressure from outside that made a difference on Bolsonaro was on trade, was the threat of sanctions on Brazilian beef, in particular in Europe.
Yeah.
That had an impact because that hit the people who it hit his supporters in their pocketbook. So there are areas, but we only have a moment longer, and I really wanted to ask you. Finally, you lived through the Bolsonaro administration. You have friends who are Indigenous people. Your whole life is committed to this cause. You go back and forth between a cabin in the north of Brazil in the middle of nowhere, and then to one of the most urban places on earth, Sao Paulo, where you are now. Through the good and the bad and these extreme changes in environment, what gives you hope for the future and keeps you at your extraordinary work?
Yes. Well, James, I think, well, what gives me hope, I think, are the children, huh? Probably because, well, I have my own, but I'm talking about indigenous children, and we go to the village, and it's really magic to see them. And well, I think they are trying to teach their children on the importance of the rainforest for them and for the planet. So we see in the last votation about the marco temporal, the temporal mark of the Constitution, uh, we saw several videos that circulated on the internet um, with children saying, uh, we protect the planet. We are here. So it's really sad for me as a Brazilian to see some areas, the river contaminated with mercury or some things like that, and children are dying because of this contamination. So all of this gives me hope. People who knows yet how to live in a way with like maybe we can say like a low carbon footstep, then but people who know how to live in connection, really connection. They don't need to deforest the forest to live there. And they know how to live with the forest alive. Not we. They don't need to kill the forest to live with them. That's the for me. This is the real difference with the well neo-colonial Brazil and these ancient Amazon people that still are there. So this gives me a lot of hope when I look at them and their smiles. That's it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. Thank you for your extraordinary commitment and your whole life. And thank you for bringing us this incredible project and sharing it with us and giving us an opportunity to be part of what you're doing. We're really grateful. And to all of you who've joined us, thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedules. And thank you for your extraordinary commitment to nature and to Rainforest Trust. Fabio's project will be up on our website shortly, but will also be supported by our Brazil Amazon Fund. So happy to discuss if anybody wants to contribute, but for now, thank you for the contribution of your time and your interest, and we really look forward to moving ahead together. Um, Fabio, stay safe, okay? And look
Yes.
forward to seeing you soon.
All right, James. Thank you very much for this invitation. It was a pleasure, and I hope we can do more of this.